University of Toronto as a professor of cinema, Canadian cinema, but also other cinema. She was among the women, and I presume a man or two, who founded the women's studies at University of Toronto. She's an author of very many books, the recipient of a lot of grants for doing research in cinema and in women's studies. She was the recipient of the YWCA's Distinguished Women's Award several years ago, and I present you Kay Armatage.
And I'm supposed to sit here?
Yep, of course.
All right. If you're comfortable, you can stand if you want to.
No.
I'll sit. Everyone is so far away. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If I speak at this? Okay. I'm delighted that you liked the film so much and saw so much in it. When I came in, I was just really shocked. I was, because I came in, I don't know what time it was, but it was, 20 minutes or half an hour into the film, and everyone in the room was so quiet because the volume was so low and you could hardly hear, and volume is so important to your sound is the sense that works at the unconscious level, at the deepest unconscious level. And for many film theorists, because sound is the first sense that we develop, hearing is the first sense that we develop, and we develop it very, very early when we're still fetuses. And, and it's apparently the last sense that goes when you die. And that film theorists think that sound and hearing in film is the part that strikes you at the deepest unconscious level. And particularly with comedy, it's very, very hard to, I think, perceive the comedic effects when the music, she's, conducting Beethoven's Fifth, and you can barely hear it, And so it's wonderful that you got as much out of it as you did, and liked it as much as you did. I just think it's an incredibly charming film. For me, I would say just my 1 minute comment is, because I've seen the film so often. I taught a course at the university in women's cinema, and of course I showed this film every time I taught the course, so I think I've seen it every other year since it was made, right? And sitting here, even in these circumstances with this small image and the volume so low, my heart leapt once again, as it always does when Polly opens that door and you see this incredible fall birch forest with the little tiny birch saplings and the golden light coming through, and they step into this other world that is so magical and so quintessentially Canadian. And to me, it's a leap of the imagination that is extraordinary in conception, and also the beauty of the idea is just overwhelming to me. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the background and the circumstances of the making of this film, because it's very poignant, I think, in many ways. And I'm going to talk about a very dry subject, which is the kind of institutional supports that were in place to allow this film to be made. You may have seen at the credits, the Canada Council and the Ontario Arts Council were thanked. Those two grant-giving council grants, not loans, not investments, but outright grants, were at the time, funding artists working in film. They, those arts granting agencies, the Ontario Arts Council is one of the largest arts councils in the world. It is about equivalent to the London Arts Council, which is quite astonishing. So they were funding not only avant-garde and experimental short films, but also documentaries and feature screenplays, and they often made contributions to the production of feature films. And many of the filmmakers who emerged in Canada in the 80s were supported by these arts councils, which often provided the first in funding, which that then they would be able to shop the film to other agencies. In about the time Patricia Rozema started working on this film, in the mid-80s, Telefilm Canada was revitalized with a feature film fund that replaced what was known as the Broadcast Fund. With this new feature film fund, the maximum investment for a feature film was $1 million. It sounds like nothing now when you think about the films that are being made around the world that cost $100 million, $200 million. But $1 million was a good start for any production. Another new mandate for Telefilm was that they wanted to seek audiences for Indigenous productions. In the early 80s, which were known as the tax shelter years, I don't know if anybody's spoken to you about this, there was a film where feature films were financed principally by private investors, and who would get a tax write-off for their investment. And films were financed, you would sell so many units at $10,000 each and hope that your rich dentist was going to invest in your film. And that's how they were financed. And most of the films that were made in the early 80s were commercially intended and largely genre films. One of the most successful from that period is Black Christmas. I don't know if you're seeing that in this, because it's quite a successful and interesting film. But most of the films that were financed by that system did not see the light of day, let alone a projector and a screen. And so when the Feature Film Fund came about, federal financing became contingent upon a deal with a distributor. So they wanted to have commercial distribution for feature films in Canada, and they had a fund that gave Canadian distributors money to invest in the film. So they were still financing the film by the back door, but at least the distributor invested in the film, purchased the film in advance. So it was a kind of, and then there was a print and advertising fund as well. So that a film like this is shot in 16 millimeter, right? 16 millimeter. And they needed money to blow up to 35 so that they could be commercially distributed. So, how do I get to page 2? Oh, here it is. So, for the first time in Canadian history, there were a number of structural mechanisms in place to support production of Indigenous feature films. At just about the same time, well, let me back up a little bit. The Toronto Film Festival had been started in 1976. 10 years before this film. It was then called the Festival of Festivals. It showed films that had been hits in other festivals around the world. It didn't expect to have any premieres or anything like that. It was not the festival that we know in Toronto today. There was hardly anything going on in Toronto. There were hardly any restaurants you could get a decent meal at, for one thing. Wayne Clarkson was the director of the Toronto Festival of Festivals. And he did a wonderful thing at a certain point. He aimed higher than the films that had already been on the circuit. He went to Hollywood and he went around to all the studios there, asking if they would give Toronto Festival a premiere of a film. And he went everywhere and he couldn't get a bite until one studio had a film that they really didn't know how to market. It was made by a completely unknown filmmaker. The cast was completely unknown. And it was a large kind of ensemble cast. There were no stars in it to speak of. They didn't know how they were going to sell this film, so they said, okay, we'll give you the premiere of this film. So this was The Big Chill, which came to Toronto, had opening night, all the cast were there. All the cast are now famous people. It was just a love-in all around. This was in the early 80s. And Toronto suddenly became, the Toronto Film Festival suddenly became a place where Hollywood films would begin to launch. Well, this caught the attention of David Peterson, who was at the time the premier of Toronto. He was very, very impressed, premier of Ontario, sorry. He was very, very impressed with what the festival was doing and the excitement that it was generating. And film suddenly was on his agenda too. And in 1985, David Peterson hired Wayne Clarkson to head up. He stole him away from the festival and hired him to set up a brand new institution, which was called the Ontario Film Development Corporation. And this Ontario institution became an extraordinarily important catalyst in the Toronto film scene, which was really, not very, very active at all. The stated mandate of the OFDC was to create and stimulate employment and investment in Ontario by developing and promoting resident Ontario companies and projects producing, distributing, and marketing film, television, video works, and related products created by Canadians. So the focus was completely on Ontario and on Canadians. Wayne Clarkson immediately hired a couple of other people that had worked with him at the festival, including Bill House, who was at the time an independent film producer, and later became the head of Telefilm in Toronto, and just hired participants from various sectors. What they set about to do was to operate as an equity financer with the intention of concentrating on feature film production rather than television. That was the mandate they took on. So they had a fairly large budget in their first year, $20 million over 3 years. Doesn't sound like very much now, but it was an enormous amount, with a maximum investment of $500,000 for any film. Virtually overnight, this institution became a huge new partner for Telefilm Canada, and support for feature filmmaking was strategically organized to catalyze the industry in Ontario. I've Heard the Mermaids Singing was made in the first year of the operation of the Ontario Film Development Corporation. And they took an enormous risk. Patricia Rozema had made one half-hour film in 1985, and which she had written. And she had a very good actor in it, Linda Griffiths, who's a very, very well-known person in Toronto theatre. But it was, a half-hour drama, was all she had done. She hadn't gone to film school. At the time, there was no Canadian Film Centre, no nothing. So she came to the Ontario Film Development Corporation with the script for Mermaids. And she said she needed $350,000 to shoot the film. $350,000. And the OFDC just took it on. They financed the entire film outright. They were terrified because she was completely unknown, but somehow that spring they took it to the Cannes Festival. It was in the Critics' Week, and they all went. They took Sheila McCarthy and Paul Baillargeon. Great. Paul Baillargeon, by the way, is a Quebec filmmaker as well as an actor. She's a wonderful filmmaker. Sheila McCarthy had mostly done theater. She had been an actor in Stratford. She hadn't done a great deal of comedy. But Patricia Rozema saw immediately her potential. They took it to Cannes, and they're all of them sitting in a row in the theater. And in the first 5 minutes of the film, they knew that the audience was totally with them. They knew the entire audience was loving this film within 5 minutes. And they couldn't believe it. They were out of their minds with joy. And the film won the Prix de la Jeunesse, which is the prize given to new emerging filmmaker. And which is the biggest prize for a first feature is the Camera d'Or at Cannes, but the Prix de la Jeunesse is the second in line to that. So this Cannes success of this completely unknown production team and the provincial government sponsor had instant and far-reaching ramifications. Most acclaim for Canadian cinema, as you probably know, had accrued around Quebec cinema. Ontario cinema was not known as a quality production. The OFDC, that institution, and Patricia Rozema both jumped out as a thrilling new force in Canadian cinema. And along with them, the OFDC financed projects by writer-directors like Adam Egoyan, Ron Mann, Bruce MacDonald, Don McKellar, Deepa Mehta, Peter Mettler, Jeremy Podeswa, Patricia Rozema, of course, John Grayson, along with producers Colin Brunton, Camelia Freiberg, and others. They came bursting into the Canadian movie scene with fresh, original films that rejected not only Hollywood formulas, but also the legacy of earlier English Canadian movies. The old story about Canadian films, English Canadian films, they were downbeat films about heartbreak and loss. The famous newspaper film critic article described the Canadian films as being, full of losers. All the characters were losers. You may say that Polly is a similar character in some ways, but this comedic touch and this wonderful freshness just set the world on fire and set Canadian cinema on fire. These filmmakers were all just about 30 at the time, and despite the lack of any defining manifesto, they collaborated on each other's films in a way that was reminiscent of the Québécois film movement of the 1960s. And they immediately, or very, very quickly, became known as the Toronto New Wave. The other important additional player was the Canadian Film Centre, which was founded the year after Mermaids was made. It took the model of the American Film Institute as a training and educational facility for emerging filmmakers, rather than a conventional film school that trained applicants from scratch. They required a portfolio of completed films and a feature film script. So the implicit mandate of the Canadian Film Centre was articulated by its first director, Peter O'Brien, who described his own career as a mission to help create a popular home cinema. Rosema was never a resident of the Canadian Film Centre, but she too became central to the intensely productive filmmaking community that coalesced in Toronto at the time. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because this historical moment from which mermaids emerged was of great significance, because these institutional politics and their practices cannot be overestimated in their effects. None of the policies that facilitated the production of I've Heard the Mermaids Singing are in effect now. None of them. The Canada Council and the Ontario Arts Council no longer fund feature film projects. The OFDC was decimated when the Ontario Premier Frank Harris's Common Sense Revolution came into power in 1995. They have virtually no investment programs for feature films anymore, and solicitation of production, i.e. location services, remains as the agency's chief function now. In 2000, the Ontario Film Development Corporation morphed into the Ontario Media Development Corporation, which provides funding only on a last-in basis. And the language of the OMDC mandate has also shifted considerably. They no longer develop and promote resident Ontario companies and projects. They provide instead financial and strategic support to enable Ontario's cultural entrepreneurs to create and market new content. All of this language, right? Not feature film, not art, content again. And so it's effectively, the Ontario Film Development Corporation has effectively disappeared as an active participant. When it first came out, it was a very serious partner. You could work with Telefilm and the OFDC. You could get a budget that was a decent budget, $1 million max from Telefilm, another 500 from OFDC, and you could be on your way. If you had Canada Council, Ontario Arts Council support, National Film Board maybe came in with services, you could make even $2.5 million feature. It's none of these policies are in place anymore, and Ontario production has been an ongoing struggle ever since. Patricia Rosema's career was made by mermaids. She just jumped out incredibly quickly. She has had a very long and steady career since that time. She's made feature films and art pieces. She's directed television, she's written for television, and she became very, very prominent. Harvey Weinstein, I'm sure it's a familiar name to you. He's that notorious, he's now has the Harvey Weinstein Company, but he used to have Miramax Films with his brother. And they were the distributor in the 80s and 90s of all of the independent art films, Shakespeare in Love, all of those, you know, they were very, very aggressive marketing these films. And Harvey Weinstein loved mermaids. He loved Patricia Rosema. He virtually single-handedly financed Mansfield Park, which was another in the series of Jane Austen novels that Patricia Rosema adapted for the screen and directed in 1999. And ever since, I mean, it doesn't appear on her resume at all, but ever since she has made a very, very decent living, even when she's not making feature films, when she's not in production. She makes a very decent living working for Harvey Weinstein as a script doctor. He pulls her into practically any project that's going wrong, and she writes and directs some television films now. In 2008, she directed Kid Kittredge, An American Girl, which was part of an HBO television made for TV movies, but got a theatrical release. And in 2009, she wrote the notorious version of Grey Gardens that starred Drew Barrymore, and which was quite a radical piece, and directed quite a few of the fairly short-lived television series called Michael Tuesdays and Thursdays that was written by Don McKellar for CBC Television. She's in pre-production now with a new film which is supposed to star Ellen Page. She's always worked with wonderful actors. She's been a great director of actors everyone noticed in this film. I mean, it's astonishing, the work of a director in her first feature film with these wonderful performances. Great casting, of course, but also wonderful performances. She's a great director of actors. And she's had just a really stunning and steady career. And one of the few, I mean, that whole Toronto group, you all know their names. They're all working constantly, and practically no one knew there, or I would say, it's fair to say that most of the active filmmakers in the Toronto scene come from that period and are now at their maturity 25 years later. All of them. I mean, think of all of them. Deepa Meadow, Adam Egoyan, Bruce McDonald, his new film was just at the film festival this year. The only one I think who's emerged who wasn't in that group is Alan Zweig, who won the best Canadian feature this year at TIFF, and he's younger than they are, so he emerged a little bit later. But that's really what I wanted to. I mean, there's a kind of tragedy about it, I think, because we just, that flowering of that group of filmmakers and this wonderful bloom that is Mermaids is really not possible to do in Ontario anymore. It's really a kind of tragic thing. Do you know where the title comes from?
No.
Ah, okay. Well, okay, the one last little fact. It comes from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. T.S. Eliot was a British poet in the 1920s. Prufrock was written in the 20s. It's a poem about a man who's aging and losing his confidence, and there's a section of the poem where he says, do I dare to eat a peach? Should I wear my trousers rolled? Should I, he doesn't know where he's going to go in his life. The famous first lines of the poem you must have heard. They echo in my head over and over again. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is laid out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. That was the very modernist, and the lament of the poem is as this elderly man is sort of fading into he doesn't know what. He says, I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing for me. So I've heard the mermaids singing as a title is a kind of affirmation. There is that, it's haunted by the Prufrock poem where the second line is that they're singing to each other and not to me. I don't think they'll sing to me. But indeed, I think by the end of the film, you have the feeling that they are singing to her. They are singing to Polly, and it's not that hopeless kind of blasted vision of modern life that T.S. Eliot projected.
Thank you, Emma.